We're talking about France and the social, civic and political unrest on the streets of France, once again swathed in clouds of tear gas. This time the issue is race relations and police brutality after the killing of a 17-year-old teenager, Nahel, in the suburb, if that's the right word, of Nanterre outside Paris. Let's speak to Nabila Ramdani. She's a French-Algerian journalist and author of the forthcoming book, Fixing France, an analytical guide to France and its people, the myths and the universal ideals that hold France together. Nabila, good morning.
Good morning, Matt. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's really good to speak to you. So it's interesting. I mean, everyone who's been to Paris, I go to Paris a lot for work and for pleasure. You see, the three principles of the revolution written on the front of just about every public building: égalité, fraternité, and so on. But it's so often that these principles rub up against the reality of what goes on in French society. What's going on right now where you are?
Well, absolutely, Matt. I think that's the crux of the matter. I think what we're witnessing effectively in this latest instance of police brutality is that France is miserably failing to uphold its values and its noble principles of liberty, equality and fraternity for all. Yeah. And there are regular complaints for large sections of society that include young men in particular from African or North African backgrounds who regularly complain about discrimination in all spheres of their lives, from education opportunities to housing to employment, and that includes police violence. And I've spent the last few days in Paris, and the rioting that is happening is unprecedented. And it's not just in Nanterre where the shooting happened. It's all across France. And despite drastic measures being implemented, such as curfews starting from 9 p.m., the latest figure from the Interior Ministry, as far as last night alone is concerned, is almost 1,000 arrests.
More. I think it's 1,300, actually. It's extraordinary.
Exactly, and it keeps the figure keeps being updated. But an interesting statistic is that the arrests so far, since Tuesday night, if you look at the arrests, the average age of those arrested is between 17 and 19. So these are very youthful riots, and it's almost a new youthful way, if you like, for French citizens who are rebelling against the system. And in many ways, a lot of the rioters have the same profile as Nahel Merzouk. They have an African background and they complain about persistent discrimination.
And that's the point, isn't it? They are French citizens. Nahel was born in France. He is as French as Jean-Pierre down the road, who doesn't have a Moroccan or Algerian background. But he feels that he's being treated differently.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, we've heard from the United Nations only yesterday. They have expressed huge concern about racism, institutional racism within the police force. And France itself, France's own anti-discrimination bodies, has found that if you are of an African or indeed an Arab background, you are 20 times more likely to be stopped and searched by police. There are regular concerns and condemnations coming from the human rights, the European Court of Human Rights as well, all ignored by France, of course. But I think and we're seeing this kind of reactionary, even illustrated by the Macron administration. I think, Macron very much views these riots as a law and order problem. And he's throwing more and more police at this issue. And let me tell you, they are not just beat policemen, they are highly trained riot officers. Sure. Wearing body armor.
Although we did hear from Sophie Pedder just now that, Macron spent some time down in Marseille as this thing was erupting, to look at the societal issues behind this kind of violence and behind racism against French Algerian citizens and so on. And we have a very lively debate in this country about institutional racism in our police force, and reports have been issued and mea culpas have been issued as well. Is France discussing that issue? Is it talking about institutional racism in the institutions, especially of law and order, in the way that we are in this country?
No, I think France is in complete denial, and the very fact that officially ethnic statistics are banned, it gives you, an idea that France is not keen on looking into the problem, because if you can't measure the problem properly, then you can't deal with it. And the fact that there are no official religious or ethnic statistics is an expression of that. But dare I say, the fact that Nahel was Algerian is very important in all of this, because it has his killing by an agent of the state, a serving police officer, has exposed the treatment of similar French citizens. And there have been tensions between Algerian communities and the French police, going right back to the days when Algeria was a French colony. Now, Algeria won a very savage war of independence, which ended in 1962. But this has caused huge anger and grievance among millions of French nationalists who wanted to hang on to Algeria. And they manifest their votes in parties like the National Rally, formerly known as the National Front. Nanterre, in particular, has historical resonance because it was the site of the biggest shanty towns in France in the 1950s and 1960s, where up to 10,000 North African migrant workers, mainly from Algeria, were parked there with no running water or electricity. And most of the men were viewed by the French security as an enemy within. And they were branded insurgents. They were subjected to extrajudicial killing, wounding and torture, particularly by the Paris police, who had a notorious reputation for extreme barbarity. Now, that has reached a low point in October 61, when riot control squads massacred up to 300 Algerians in cold blood in central Paris during a peaceful anti-Algerian war demonstration. Now, bodies, mutilated bodies were thrown off bridges in the River Seine.
But that's what you're describing, though, crucially, is the background of violence that has not been forgotten, either by those who wanted to, the Pieds Noirs and their like, who wanted to hold on to the colony of Algeria, or indeed those who suffered the violence at the end of, at the hands of the police and so on. I mean, that Algerian War of Independence was so violent. And I mean, it cost what? I think 1 million lives, 1 million people were killed. It was extraordinarily violent, and it happened in the early 60s.
Yes. And crucially, I think the fact that the War of Independence was effectively important to central Paris is hugely relevant for the descendants of those Algerians. But crucially, the crimes that were committed in the 60s were covered up for decades. And it's very in keeping with the way Paris traditionally treats its Algerians. Nobody has ever been brought to justice. And the fear in Nahel's case is that it will happen again. Yeah. That, we have a police officer who has been indicted with a voluntary manslaughter, but there are huge concerns that, a few weeks down the line, he'll be let out on bail and being given a slap on the wrist further down the line, and all will be forgotten. Now, those shanty towns in Nanterre have turned into bleak council estates, and the descendants of those migrant workers now live there. And there is absolutely no doubt that the legacy of the atrocities of the past is now affecting the febrile atmosphere that we found in France today.
So is Macron serious about finding a solution to this? And what do you think the solution should be? Because France is, on the edge of a volcano here, isn't it?
Yes, and I think Macron has started off by being very conciliatory to the point of, in a very unusual way by a French president, effectively calling the killing unlawful. And he came under harsh criticism from police union, who quite fairly said that the executive shouldn't interfere with judicial process. But and since then, he has completely rowed back, and he's desperate to come across as pro-police, to the extent that he's throwing more armed police officers, more paramilitaries to the problem. I don't think in the long term this will solve any of these very deep-seated problems. I think there has to be policies that bring ethnic minorities who are currently stuck on those grim housing estates into mainstream society.
And
that they should be given life chances, and that they should be given opportunities.
Indeed. And what's your response to him saying, parents, look after your children, don't let them run riot?
Well, I think that's just sound bites, you know, and to be fair, you know, there has been a huge amount of destruction and indeed looting. So one shouldn't condone criminal behavior as well. It's right and proper for people to go take to the streets and express their anger. But this kind of criminality is clearly something that is inflaming the situation.
But law and order is also not the only solution to this.
No, but what is also unhelpful is when you have police unions describing the rioters as hordes of savages and vermin. Now, this is just
which is extraordinary, isn't it? That language really shocked me. I should have mentioned that with Sophie Pedder earlier, but that language was, the language of war.
Yes, they literally said, they put a statement out there saying they were at war with the vermin. And it's just a kind of inflammatory and, dare I say, colonial language that sums up the divide in France between, on the one hand, the reactionary establishment backed up by a hugely powerful security state, including many paramilitaries, and lots of people from ethnic minority backgrounds who feel they are being discriminated against and they are still treated like second-class citizens.
And finally, Nabila, is this now calming down as the Interior Minister has suggested it might be, or is this going to get worse and worse?
Well, today is a very important day as far as protest is concerned because it's Nahel's funeral. It's taking place in Nanterre. The family have asked for the media to stay away, but there will, of course, be thousands of people turning up to pay a tribute to this young man. And you never know how things can unfold. I mean, I was involved. I took part in the Marche Blanche the other day, which was an entirely peaceful march. But then paramilitaries turn up and they start smothering people with tear gas and things get out of hands.
Indeed they do. Nabila Ramdani, French-Algerian journalist, thank you very much indeed for your contribution to the programme.